Hi folks, you've Tassos today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this presentation. In this essay I'd like to talk about a young Napoleon Bonaparte and look at his early life before he was touched by fame and notoriety. So we're talking really from his birth in August 1769 up to say middle to late 1794. So it's before the big battles and so on. Now Napoleon's obviously an interesting subject to discuss. I see him as one of the greatest generals, if not the greatest general or military strategist, tactician of all time. Alexander the Great is considered for this this accolade, but Alexander's great victories were typically, all bar one, I think, were really in a crumbling Persian Empire, where the troops that turned up on the battlefield to fight Alexander were more concerned with running away and taking bribes than they were with fighting pitched battles. So that's not to take anything away from Alexander. I mean, clearly he was a great general, but Napoleon was fighting first-rate opponents who were all willing to die for their king or their czar or whatever, and yet Napoleon was to have victory after victory and was really, other than being completely overwhelmed by weather or by numbers that were so numerous that nobody could have won. And if we take the Battle of Waterloo, which is sort of waved around as a crushing defeat for Napoleon, it was actually a very close run thing at Waterloo. If the Prussians had arrived even a few hours later to the battlefield, the British would have been defeated, and then Napoleon could have defeated the Prussians in turn. Now, Waterloo would have been a costly victory. Casualties were heavy, expenditures of resources were huge, so there's a decent chance Napoleon would have been overwhelmed anyway in the ensuing months as Austrian and Russian armies were mobilising. But nonetheless, it was a very close-run thing, and we need to understand that Napoleon really, bullet for bullet, man for man, soldier for soldier, remained undefeated in his entire time as a general and of course generalissimo really of France. So was Napoleon, was it evident from early childhood or early adolescence that he was destined for great things? Well, not really. And as we go through this, many people will be surprised to know there were two times in Napoleon's relatively young life when he contemplated suicide. Clearly we're talking about a driven young man here, and a man who fancied himself, because he was born in Corsica, which is an island off the southeast coast of France, and it was closer to Italy than it was to France. It was, in fact, an Italian or regional, provincial Italian possession, the island of Corsica, before the French took it over. And it was only a couple of years before Napoleon was born where the French absorbed Corsica into their realm and gave some of the local Corsican politicians positions in the various assemblies and so on in France, in Paris. So Napoleon, as a child growing up, who was a good student at school, he fancied himself along the lines of being a local Corsican freedom fighter, in effect, and he perceived his career or his future as he imagined as a 10 or 11-year-old. He perceived his future as being a local Corsican political heavy, and of leading the Corsican island into a state of independence, in effect, or a fully self-governing territory within the wider French Empire. So Napoleon very much saw himself as a local Corsican boy doing Corsican things. Now, the language of Corsica was effectively Italian, and certainly on the street. The minor nobility of Corsica, of which Napoleon's family was a part, they started to learn French, but Napoleon spoke French with a very heavy regional Italian type accent to the French. So he got a bit of ribbing and stirring about that. Now, when the French appointed a governor, and the governor attempted to make friends with the local nobilities and minor nobility and citizens of consequence, and that involved Napoleon's family. So his family became quite chummy with the French governor, and his parents lobbied the governor to try and get Napoleon, a young Napoleon who was like 11 or 12 by this stage, try and get him a position in a military school in France. Now, without the intervention of this French governor, the governor of Corsica, Napoleon wouldn't have had a snowball's chance of getting into this. He was put into a very low-level college, like out of the military colleges in France. This would have been one of the sort of the lower ones, very limited in the prestige here. But so let's take up where Napoleon is going here. Now, he's a decent student, quite a good student at school, and he goes to the military college in France. It's a boarding school, and his clumsy and heavily accented Italian-type French makes him an object of sneering derision of the other students, as there's hardly any. Now, I should add here that Parisian-spoken French was considered, how it was done, a bit like the Queen's English in England sort of thing, but all the regional accents of France, and there were many, all the regional accents were viewed as a little bit strange by the Parisian people. So this idea that Napoleon was particularly shunned or sneered at or made fun of, that doesn't really fly here. There were many regional accents around at the time, and particularly in this school, where any Parisian family with connections were getting their kids into the top flight schools, and this was a lower rung school, so there would have been a lot of regional accents. So this idea that Napoleon was particularly singled out and treated badly, I don't buy that. There would have just been too many regional. The Corsican accent, as in the Italianized Corsican French, would have probably been a little bit novel in itself, but I don't think Napoleon would have particularly stood out given all the other the many regional accents there would have been. He was clearly an above average student, and he excelled at mathematics, particularly the new school of mathematics that was to do with ballistics and logistics, which had implications for the military side. Obviously it was a military school, but ballistics being the increasingly important area of artillery. Artillery had played a role, but not to the extent that we were seeing now, where it was seen that if used properly, it could be decisive in a battle. So it now was the artillery was or the use of artillery and its deployment was now considered to be something of an elite area of the military structure. But only those who were particularly good at mathematics, and when I say mathematics, I'm talking about geometry, plotting trajectories of shells, how much gunpowder you put into at what elevation to go what distance to create what damage. These sort of calculations tended to favour people that were quick on the uptake on mathematics, and there weren't many of those around, surprisingly, at the time. And this was something that Napoleon excelled at. And given that the artillery was becoming, again, an elite and prestigious area of the military, here's this kid coming in who's particularly or unusually bright in the mathematics of ballistics and so on. So he graduated only 15 years from this college. The kids there were graduating at 15 or 16, so that in itself wasn't unusual. But he was particularly it was noted that he was particularly good at mathematics and the mathematics of artillery. So he won, in effect, a position into a military school in Paris, and this is a much more prestigious military school. As everyone you were swearing loyalty to the king when you went into the military. So, ironically, strangely, Napoleon's patron when he enters the military school in Paris is none other than King Louis, whose head was going to be chopped off in a few years' time. He graduated from this military, so again, quite a prestigious military school in Paris, with ballistics and mathematics, ballistics as being his best subject. And he was given the position, a commission as a lieutenant, and he's only 17. So this is for some regional kid from Corsica. This is quite an achievement. It's largely on merit. If he was even recommended for going into the Navy, because the Navy was upgunning its ships and was much more reliant on the amount of cannons on a ship, how effective could broadsides be, and this sort of stuff. So ballistics was clearly an issue on ships, and so he was considered for the Navy, but he stayed with the Army on this. He then moved into the Army as lieutenant, and looking at more field level type experience and ground level war game type stuff. So getting some good experience there. Now, what's interesting at this point is Napoleon still doesn't see his future lies in France or in the French army. This is a strange thing here that isn't really covered much by the historians. Napoleon still sees that his future lies in being politically active in Corsica, and again his dream of being a Corsican nationalist freedom fighter type guy who's going to lead Corsica into independence. This was very much in Napoleon's mind, and really he got leave to go back to Corsica in 1788, ostensibly to visit his family, but the reality is he's dabbling in Corsican politics and trying to gain supporters and so on so he can take a senior role in the Corsican political scene. So anyway, he comes back to that. Doesn't work out so much. He's not really achieving anything there. So he's back in advanced artillery school in the end of 1788, and also focusing on things like battlefield application. He's still quite sympathetic to the French monarchy. He's got no thoughts at this time that anyone's aware of to engage in revolution. But by the way, this is sort of just before the meeting of the Estates General in May 1789. But even after the meeting of the Estates General, it's certainly not clear that the monarchy is going to be got rid of. It's more likely going to go into some sort of constitutional monarchy, which is fine with Napoleon. He's got nothing against the monarchy at all. Now, as the revolution starts to spiral sort of a little bit further out of control, but before the Reign of Terror begins, Napoleon again returns to Corsica with another attempt to become influential in local Corsican politics. Again, it doesn't work out so well, and so in 1792, when the revolutionary stuff's really starting to gather speed, Napoleon's back in Paris, and this time he's promoted to the rank of captain in an artillery regiment. Bear in mind he's only 23 at this point, so this is pretty impressive for anybody. Again, from a regional boy from Corsica, which is the back blocks was considered to be. So now now Napoleon isn't impressed by this. It's taken him 6.5 years or so to move from lieutenant to captain, and Napoleon views he's a driven guy. He wants to go places. He wants to do stuff. He wants to be a big player on the scene. Again, he's more thinking of Corsica than France, but he sees the prestige that he can gain by being an officer in the French army. He can use this and leverage this to play the big time guy in the much smaller much smaller pond of Corsican politics. So he's thinking of the prestige these positions give him, but it's taken 6.5 years or so to go from lieutenant to captain in the artillery. He perceives himself as a very well qualified artillery officer, which he is, by the way, and he'd have been better than probably most of the guys around. So he's very upset by this, and he contemplates suicide. Now, or so it's said. Now, when you're talented and driven and an outsider, those are typically ingredients for people to become to be plagued by self-doubt. Am I going to make it? These people don't really like me. They don't want me around. I'm not one of them. Da, 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 da. It's easy to get into that mindset and to become gloomy, even melancholy, when one looks at the future and thinks of one's prospects, which Napoleon was clearly doing at this point. I think this is an area that, again, historians don't give enough time to just the extent to which Napoleon was driven. But the reason he wanted these accolades in the French army was so he could use it back in Corsica to justify his ideas about being a heavy hitter in the local Corsican politics. Now, if you look at, so he's captain, but he sees this as just far too slow. He returns again to Corsica, a little bit annoyed, or not a little bit annoyed, depressed, I guess, morose about what's happening with his career. It's just not moving fast enough. So he comes back to Corsica in late 1792. Now, his absences from Paris and from France, particularly from Paris, are actually work heavily in his favour, because he's not getting caught up in the local revolutionary politics, which is quite deadly. The guillotine is sort of an omnipresent consideration for anyone who's in the political scene in Paris at the time, and is one group over another, the Jacobins over the Convention, over the Girondins, and so on, all these different groups vying for primacy, and all busily running around accusing each other, arresting each other, and of course killing each other. So Napoleon's absences means that he's not caught up in this politics. He's not caught up in these deadly politics. So he's not one of the at the time. I mean, later on this comes along. He's not one of the people that's getting accused and dragged off to the guillotine. So this works quite heavily in his favour. And of course, he's still only a captain at this point. So he's not a senior enough for people to worry about him and think about killing him. Now, while he's in Corsica in 1792. He really ups the ante in his dabbling in the local politics, and he ends up pissing off a lot of people, and to the point where in 1793, the middle of 1793, his family has to actually flee Corsica because the goons are out to get him there if he doesn't get out of the place. And he has to take his family with him. Now he's only back in France a few months, and he's in South France, and in 1793 the British fleet arrives in Toulon, which is a naval port city on the south coast of France, not far from Corsica, and the local government there is royalist, and they effectively hand over the port and sections of the city to the British, which who land soldiers there, and even some Spanish detachments also arrive to help the British and help the royalists. Now, the local artillery commander, French Revolutionary army, was wounded and semi-invalided, and the only other artillery officer around at the time, the Captain Napoleon, the only artillery officer had any expertise in actually using artillery was Napoleon, and he was there. Now, there was a military committee that had on it a fellow Corsican who was known to the Bonaparte family, and he came forward. Well, why don't you use this guy, the Captain Napoleon Bonaparte? He's a qualified artillery officer and came top of his class in mathematics, all this sort of stuff. So this was done with some reluctance, because the view was that he was young. He was still only 23. He was young, and or I think he just turned 24 at this point. He was young and hadn't been in battle before. So and he was a Corsican. So his loyalty, certainly by the local army guys there, were considered to be a little uncertain. Nonetheless, the military committee said, no, you got to use this guy. He's there. And Napoleon, this is where you start to see a Napoleon that's going to be a player in the future. Whether it's going to be the emperor as he became, or just a very formidable general. You're already seeing the signs of the very formidable general. Now, given that Napoleon didn't come from, if you like, the establishment or the aristocracy, or even the upper and pretentious middle class of Paris, Napoleon looked at things differently. One of the concerns at fighting off the British at Toulon was that there just simply weren't enough cannon there, and the British had more cannon. and that the chances of evicting the British was pretty slim. They were hoping to maybe contain the British in Toulon. The Revolutionary French Army contained the British, but they didn't expect that they were going to have the resources to evict them. And here's where you see a Napoleon in operation. Napoleon looks around and says, okay, we haven't got enough cannon, that's accepted. So he goes and looks around, as much as 200 kilometres away from where Toulon was, even going into North Italy and the French forces that are there, and saying and asking for the cannon, and say, look at all these cannon. There's cannon all over the place that are being unused. They're just sitting there doing nothing. Why don't we go and gather all this cannon from these other places and bring it to Toulon and use this to give our side overwhelming superiority and firepower, and let's blast the British guys out of here. So this was considered to be, well, you can't do that. That's not done. That's not how things are done around here. And no, we can't do that. That's impossible. But Napoleon brushed all this aside, and he went straight to the committee and said, "This is what I want to do. Will you endorse it?" And he said why, and he put forward quite a cogent plan, really. So this indicates his ability to his capacity to just think outside the square, think outside the box, his capacity to quickly put a plan in place and do the logistics. Okay, this is going to need 100 horses, and this is going to need this, and it's going to need that. It's going to need so much gunpowder, and we're going to get it from here. And okay, this place has got gunpowder, but that place has got cannons. These guys have got cannonballs, but no cannon. And Napoleon would do this investigation, and he would do the research, and then he would get all this. Now, this was a level of planning and detail, and putting the planning and the war material, the cannon, the cannonballs, putting that into a plan and then applying it practically to the battlefield. This was quite a new thing. Not that no one had ever done it in the past or whatever, but Napoleon combined all these things with artillery and the planning, and this was something that I think made him stand out already at this point. Again, being a young man, he just saw this, how this could be done, and of course the British were evicted from Toulon, and this was down to Napoleon and his ability to organise the artillery and then use it again to decisive effect. Now he gets a promotion to major in October, and again to colonel while all this is going on, and also his imaginative use of artillery, his decisive use, instead of just spreading it all around and blasting away. Napoleon would look at where can we concentrate firepower to decisively win the engagement. That was very new. That was something that no one really had looked at previously, and certainly not to that degree. And this again would be a hallmark of Napoleon's battlefield tactics later on, when he was a battlefield general and of course generalissimo. Now, something like 15,000 of the Toulon royalist residents fled in fear of being guillotined, and were ferried to safety by the British fleet. Now, this is Napoleon's achievements here are all recognised, and by February 1794, he's promoted to Brigadier General of Artillery, and this is really the beginning of things here. Now, he's also moved in as the senior artillery officer to the French army, which is campaigning in northern Italy. The Austrians have stationed an army there, and this is considered to be a threat to French interests. So a French army is sent to deal with it, and again Napoleon is the artillery officer. Now the general in charge of the French army was glowing in his praise of Napoleon. He said Napoleon's logistical management, his application and tactical use of artillery on the battlefield has won us these battles. Our victories are down to this artillery officer. So this was something that in military circles at least, Napoleon was already standing out. Like, well, wow, this guy really knows how to use artillery. He can win battles just by the use of, or primarily at least by the use of artillery. Now, around the middle of 1794, this is the high point of the paranoid dramas going on in Paris. This is the end of Maximilien Robespierre and so on. So the fall of Robespierre and his goons, to be replaced by another bunch of goons in the first instance. But because Napoleon was friendly with Robespierre's brother, who was also guillotined, by the way, Napoleon was arrested, guilt by association. It was only brief. It was only a few weeks or so, and he was out of. He was released from prison, but it must have been a situation that gave him a bit of a start, because effectively arbitrary arrest arbitrary detention, although he was cleared. By now he was in considerable debt because he was trying to play the big social scene, and which was well beyond his means, and it was expensive to be in Paris at the time. And he was also told that he was taken off the active list of artillery officers because of his supposed suspect associations with Robespierre, or Robespierre's brother rather. Once again, we find Napoleon contemplating suicide, even going as far as he'd throw himself under a carriage or something like that. So now, at that time when Napoleon was probably at one of his lowest ebbs, again, we're talking a young man with great ambition and drive and so on, who just thinks, I'm not achieving what I think I should be achieving. And he's his own harshest sort of judge and critic. You know, why am I not doing better, and that sort of thing. So, but there's a change in war minister in the French, the revolutionary government, and this time Napoleon gets appointed as like an organisational staff officer in Paris. So he's the high point of the people being dragged off to the guillotines now passed. There's a more upper middle class, sensible, sober sort of people starting to take control of the French government. So political assassination wasn't sort of foremost on people's minds anymore. But while he's a staff officer, it gave him the opportunity to rub shoulders with the people who mattered and the people who could bestow promotions on him and things like that. And he was considered to be bright and a notorious flatterer of people with power. And so there was an angry working class mob that was roaming around Paris at the time Napoleon was there, and they were quite justifiably angry that the reason that the French Revolution began was the high price of bread, which drove the mob crazy, the sans-culottes and so on. And but the price of bread had kept on increasing, so the plight of the working class was worse now than it had been at the beginning of the revolution when the king was in charge. So the mob, quite rightly, was saying, hey, nothing's improved for us. You guys are helping yourselves, the upper middle class guy. You guys are helping yourselves, but where's the bonus for us? Why is the price of bread? Why is bread not affordable? Why is the price of butter out of control, and so on? So there was a mob converging on the what was the convention at the time, which was the name of what was the government then, and the mob was a bit on the ugly side. There was there'd been politicians being grabbed and beaten up and so on. So Napoleon being one of the artillery officers, and they decided that they would use cannon to shoot it. And so they went to Napoleon and said, look, sight some cannons in the street that approached the parliament or the convention where the politicians were meeting, and if the mob won't disperse, So there was a number of officers who were shy, and Napoleon was also shy, about firing on fellow citizens. The revolution was meant to improve the lives of the working class, and it clearly wasn't. And there were a number of people that were officers in the army that were nervous about shooting on their fellow citizens. And there were two reasons for this. One, they didn't want to shoot their fellow citizens, but the other thing was if they did that and the current government changed and different people came into power, they could very easily come along and say that the general who'd ordered the cannons to be shot should be taken out the back and guillotined. So there's a lot of nervousness about it. Napoleon decided to take the risk that the government that was in place at the moment would still be there, and that if he didn't do this, then the government probably would change. And Napoleon had actually witnessed the mob attacking the royal Tuileries Palace, where the King Louis resided, and the murdering of all the people in the household staff, the cooks, the cleaners, the maids were all brutally murdered. Napoleon witnessed this from a place across the road, and he was staggered at how the troops refused to defend the king, or did so ineffectively that they might as well not have bothered. And he commented at the time that stern, forceful, decisive measures could have stopped all this, and the king would still be alive. But so when the mob came into the roads approaching the committee, Napoleon told them to disperse. They wouldn't, so he blasted them, and over 200, in some counts as many as 300, died as a result of the filled with grape shot and so on. That Napoleon described this as give them a whiff of grape shot, so it dispersed the crowd. The government was particularly pleased with being rescued, if you like, by Napoleon and his cannons, and this guaranteed him then a position a senior position in the military, and the rest, as we say, is history. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.